Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Oxnard Live. I'm your host, Daniel Chavez Jr. As we all know, coronavirus has affected multiple sectors of our economy, from groceries to healthcare to transportation and even to our schools. Last week, we had Superintendent Dr. Tom McCoy of the Oxnard Union High School District join us and talk to us about the experiences it's been leading the district on the high school level. Joining me tonight is former trustee of the Oxnard Elementary School District that serves students from K through eighth grade. Joining me tonight, who's also a teacher in the Rio School District. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Trustee Denis O'Leary.
There I am. Hello. And
Trustee,
thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me. I know it's not the way that we would want to have our interviews, but we want to make sure that everybody remains safe, so we do it this way. So thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. And 100 years ago in the last pandemic, they didn't have this ability. So we're doing good.
Progress, right?
That's right.
So for our guests, many, as they begin to tune in with us tonight, many know who you are and what you stand for, and many don't know who you are. So let's try to recap of how exactly you got to this point. Like I said, you're a former trustee of the Oxnard School District. How did that come about?
Yes. Well, I've been a teacher for 30 years. And only recently I retired as a teacher as well. So this school year, I'm basically trying to plan out the rest of my life from here. But I was an educator for 30 years, and I started in the Lindsay School District under an emergency credential. And basically, I had a bachelor's degree and spoke Spanish, and they hired me on the spot. In fact, apparently they needed my position so bad. In the interview, they asked me to speak Spanish for 5 minutes. After about 2 minutes, they asked me to leave the room, which usually is not a good sign. And they called me back and they asked if I could start the next week. And I almost said no because it seemed too easy. And there was no paperwork it was basically that. I taught in Lindsay, California is famous for its olives. You can go to the grocery store and find Lindsay olives. And it was a true migrant community where 95% of the kids would leave in a certain week in November because there were cherries up in Washington State. And 3 weeks later, the 95% of the kids came back on the same day. I think they took the same caravan back down south. And what an amazing experience. I moved to Ventura County and started teaching here, first in Port Hueneme. And I was asked to start up a Chicano studies class for junior high, which I did. And amazingly, in 1992, how controversial that was, to the point that I had to get permission to teach about Chicano studies or about Cesar Chavez, because I was asked, what does Cesar Chavez have to do with Chicano studies? Yes. And I think the big question is, why if somebody of my complexion would be asked to be an authority to be able to create a class like that? I moved to Santa Paula, love teaching over there. And in Santa Paula, we had the advent of Prop 187, which would have taken away all services to non-documented aliens, including health and education. Shortly after that, Prop 209, which was affirmative action. And then later, Prop 227. And all three of those propositions passed. all with 60% of the vote. Only Prop 227 was fully implemented. And luckily, we were able to overthrow that a few years ago. But my politics, probably started well before that. But that's when I got into the spotlight, where people said, asked if I could speak, especially Prop 227. I was a bilingual teacher. And at that time, I had just a year earlier become the president of the regional district for the California Association for Bilingual Education. And when I became president, it was this nice little group that teachers would get together and trade nice lesson plans. And it seemed like once I became president, Prop 227 came along, and all of a sudden I was going to Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and it just threw me into the politics, and I loved it. But we lost. And I remember one day in Santa Paula, I was walking on Main Street to go to a friend's baseball card shop. And an elderly man was walking the other direction. And I wouldn't have noticed him, except at the very last second, he took a sidestep and stood in front of me. And if I had stepped one step more, I would have knocked him over. And he had his finger up in the air, and he says, "There's no racist in Santa Paula." And he stepped aside and kept on walking. And I was kind of dumbfounded. That was not, an elderly man, I'm not going to argue in the middle of the street. But, my thought at the time was, and if you keep on saying that, maybe you'll believe it after a while. So apparently, when you get involved in politics, if you make everybody happy, you're not doing anything. And it seemed like I was taking on the causes that made a lot of people not happy. But I'm happy I did. Shortly after that, maybe a year later or what, out of the blue, I got 4 or 5 phone calls from superintendents here in the county. And unsolicited, they were asking if I would think about working in their districts. Seemed kind of odd. I wasn't looking for a job. Well, later I find out that the superintendent in Santa Paula at the time, apparently, all the superintendents meet monthly. That I know now as a trustee. And apparently the superintendent at the time had badmouthed me. But what she said apparently impressed other superintendents to call up and offer me a job. And I remember getting a phone call from Yolanda Benitez, who at the time was the superintendent in El Rio, and turning to my wife and saying, El Rio has a population that's very similar to Santa Paula, which today I would disagree with, but at the time I didn't know better. And I said, maybe I should go over there. It's a nice, quiet district. So I went to El Rio to teach bilingual education. And can I say the shit hit the fan about this as the moment I stepped into El Rio? I don't know if I could say that, but hey, I did. In the meantime, I was the district director of LULAC at the time. And I say that because shortly after I landed in El Rio, the school board in El Rio decided to get rid of Yolanda Benitez, which happens. Most superintendents only stay in a district 2 or 3 years anyway. That's the average. But in her case, they had about 12 different charges. They wanted to charge her. Why? And by the way, the school board in El Rio was all Latino, 5 members, all Latinos. It's a fallacy that Latinos support each other all the time. Personally, that's the crabs in the bucket story. But amongst those 12 charges, about 6 of them had to do with civil rights. And one of them in particular was that she was being fired because she was hiring too many Latinos. And I remember that because people would come to me and they were very concerned that myself and LULAC would get involved in supporting her. And my answer was, if she was an African American superintendent and the school board had decided to get rid of her because she was hiring too many African Americans, would you be surprised if the NAACP didn't get involved? And I was the head of LULAC. I said, we have to get involved. Now, that also put a big target on my forehead because I also worked there. And personally, I had a lot of strife for years because of my actions of that time in that case. I had death threats. All kinds of other, things. She won the case. She actually later it went to court many times, and she is the only person to have received a large settlement, $1.4 million, because of a Brown Act violation. And people that listen to, your broadcast probably know what a Brown Act violation is. You have to give a 24 hours notice before you vote on something. And Brown Act violations are actually quite common. And the reason we don't hear about them is because usually they're corrected by putting the same item on the next agenda and voting on it again. Well, that school board decided not to do it. And each time it went to court, the sum went up and she came out over $1 million in her pocket. And so I was, she won her case morally, I guess, legally. And I'm sitting in this district that despises me because, I supported her civil rights. Oh, well. And by the way, I didn't make a penny from that, and neither did LULAC, and I didn't expect any and don't ask for any. But, sometimes to do the right thing, you have to stir the pot. I ran for a school board, lost. And unfortunately, about 2 years after I lost, one of the trustees passed away. And there was an opening on the school board. And I was one of 12 people to go to public interviews. I'll tell you, I'd rather run in a political race any day. And from the 12, I was the only candidate that had opposition. And in the opposition were some of the people that, came up and said terrible things while I was supporting the civil rights issue in El Rio. Go figure. And I got on the school board. So it wasn't pretty, but I think I took the right road, and I hope I helped.
Just for clarification, the school board that you're referring to is the Oxnard Elementary School Board, not
correct. And yes, and in fact, for years, I had people say that I was illegal because they figured I was teaching in the same school district that I was on the board, which you cannot do. And no, I was employed in El Rio, and I was a trustee for the Oxnard School District.
Now, everything that you said is literally the history that I know about you. I have always known you to stand up for migrant workers, for this community, the city of Oxnard, which is over 72% Hispanic Latinos. That's your history. You have always been a very strong advocate, and it's also notable that you're also an author. And you have written books before about Cesar Chavez and about other things. You're also a painter. You have a few paintings that are circled around the culture. So it's interesting to hear how you got to this point of becoming a trustee and your advocacy over the years, and how somebody just simply looked at you and figured, this can't be right. Where's the real person that's doing all of this fighting for this community? Because
and I still get that.
I'm sure you do. It's one of those things that people don't realize that it's not necessarily the color of your skin, but it's about your heart and what you are willing to stand up for and fight for. And that is definitely what you've shown every single time, your passion and your heart to really stand up and fight for a community. It's also notable that the NAACP was actually started by a white man, a Caucasian male. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but nobody expected that. But that is the history, and we need to hold on to our history and the good history, and keep in mind of the bad history so that we don't repeat those. So
and
yes,
need allies. The one thing, and to this day, periodically, out of the blue, I'll have people that they look at me like they've been thinking about this for a while, and they finally ask, why are you doing this? And, hell, if 80% of my neighbors were purple, I would want to make sure that the purple people were treated well and with respect. So, it doesn't matter. By the way, I did actually study in school, in high school, and lived in Chile for several years as well. And so, I do know, how it feels to live in Latin America. And in fact, for many of those years, it was during the time of Pinochet, the dictator. And I've been tear gassed many times and had Uzis pointed at me more times than I would like to remember. That was standard issue for the military police, by the way, at the time. I get into it not just stumbling around saying, hey, I want to help. Again, if you see that your neighbor is being mistreated or disrespected, I know you would stand up for that neighbor as well.
yes, and then anyone who knows me knows that I tend to use my voice and stand up for what I believe in. And many times, just like yourself, it always ends up getting on the wrong side of people. But if you're always on the good side, like you said, then you're not doing something right. So
That's right.
that's good to know. Now, talking about your time as an Oxnard School District trustee,
Right.
there was a lot of controversy even then. You brought issues that typically wouldn't be issues that a school district would address. And again, it goes back to the demographics of our city and where that district lied in. Tell us a little bit about those challenges of trying to get the fellow trustees to jump on board with many of those very challenging issues.
And I can claim some victory, part of some victory on many issues. But honestly, there were a lot of issues that in 17 years of being a trustee, I failed. So, it's a moving target. And, I've had people claim that I had an agenda. And my answer is damn right. Then I usually follow up with, would you want somebody in an elected office that did not have an agenda? So it's not an offense to say that you have an agenda. When I first got on the school board, the two main issues that I felt needed to be directed at was bilingual instruction, because I knew the law. And even though it was banned, there were ways to honor the will of the parents and the students. And at that time also, we had a multi-track year-round school year where we fit 4 students into 3 chairs and rotated them. It was dismal. It terribly obstructed education of the kids. And I'll bring this up now, and I'll compare this later. There's always been standardized test scores, and I'm not a big fan of standardized test scores, but they are a canary in the mines. And when I bring up numbers, people say, well, that was a different test. Well, yeah, every few years we change the test. But the one bar is that at any given time, the state has said, your students should pass this level, and there's a mark. When I first got on the school board, it was about 9% of our kids that were above what the state had expected. Only 9%. That's a 91% failure rate. And part of that was because of our multi-track year-round school system. People, I had people would claim that somehow it was better, but then they usually turned it into how the teachers were able to get the golf courses in off season instead of, how the students were doing better. It took I was the voice that actually tipped it. Before I got on the board, everybody said it could never be done. And when I got on the board, I was thrilled to see the other trustees that were with me. They wanted it to get done, but they didn't know they had the majority. Nobody had talked about, getting off. And so I was kind of the one that finally pushed it to where it got moving. And luckily, and it took a few years because of the logistics and because we needed schools, we needed classrooms. But it started almost immediately, and it took about 3 or 4 or 5 years, and we got off of that plan. And all of a sudden, each step that we took, it went in steps. Test scores started going up, and the education of the kids started going up, not only because of this, but it was a major contributor. And we got to a point about 8-9 years ago where just under 50% of our kids were passing that state standard. Now, it's not something to celebrate. The majority of our kids were still failing. But it was about half of our kids were hitting the state standard, and the numbers were going up. Another major part of that was at one time, all 21 schools in our school district seemed to have their own plan. And it depended on the principal, and they even had different books and different, and it came to a point that myself and my fellow trustees, I don't want to take the credit for everything because I'm one of 5 members as a trustee. We decided to standardize the education in all 21 schools. Because go figure, the kids in the affluent neighborhoods did really good. And the kids in the poorer neighborhoods didn't do good at all. And unfortunately, in Oxnard, we have more poorer neighborhoods than we have affluent neighborhoods. We standardized the instruction, that they had to use the same books, the same programs. Each teacher might present it differently, and that's fine. There's something to be said about, individuality, but at least the same materials and the same effort was spent on every school, no matter what part of Oxnard it was in. And we got to a point that just under 50% of our kids were passing state standards. I do not elect my fellow trustees. And there was a change, and there were a couple trustees that came onto the board, one in particular who was an ex-principal. And even though I've always sat with only Democrats as a trustee, in education, there's a lot of arguments. And one of the arguments was class size reduction. I was on the losing side of that for years, up until the day I left, because the board believes that it doesn't matter how many students are in a classroom, the kids can all learn. Well, I can also point out that at that high mark that we got of just under 50% of the kids passing, unfortunately today, even though I've argued this and a few other things in the process, I've been known as the Lone Ranger for the last several years on the school board. We're back down to only 9% of our kids passing that state level, that state mark. We were rising, we were helping kids, and for some reason, the scores have been dismal. And it's not, so again, I always knew that there would be more work to be done when I left, but it's a pain to think that even though things had improved, we're down to 91% of our kids failing again. And that's before the pandemic and the weight of doing classes on the internet.
Now,
And
I'm sorry, Trustee. I just want to ask, during this time that you've been on the board for the 17 years, now it's worth noting that you, amongst the five of you guys select the clerk of the board and you
right.
select the board president. It's not a rotational, so it's a majority vote. During those 17 years, you weren't able to hold either one of those positions. Can you
I was
talk a
clerk
little
like four
bit?
times. I
Okay.
was clerk 4 times, which is basically like being radar on the MASH TV show. I was signing papers, but that's about all I could do. I was board president one time 12 years ago.
Okay. Okay.
And that was just before we hit that high mark, the 50% mark. It was with that one change that I talked about earlier. And, the motives of other people, I don't like to guess the motives of other people. I know my motives. But let's just say that I had 2 trustees in the last 10 years say that I would never be a board president because having a minority school board with a white president would not look good.
Mm.
What can I say? And that angers me quite a bit. And no, I've never claimed to be Latino. I've never claimed to be African American, but yet I have been involved with Black Lives Matters, not only locally, but in other parts of the state as well. And I've been involved in the Latino community more than most. And what a terrible thing to say that I could never be board president because I was white. Oh, well.
Yeah, that's definitely completely inappropriate and a horrible thing to even fathom that an elected official would make those comments. But as we see, even in today's politics over the past few years, um, it's far-fetched, but at the same time not. We see it on news, we see it on social media, elected officials making these comments that are completely inappropriate and just disrespectful all around.
And I got to say, the reaction to those comments is the second I say that, I want to be very careful. People that know me, I think, would understand, but it's the people that don't know you. Because if I jumped up and said that publicly at the moment, all of a sudden it would be construed that somehow I was, behind white supremacy or something. And racism goes in many directions, even within the same race,
Yeah.
by the way. And it's an interesting social study to see it happen in action sometimes.
Exactly. I want to jump to an item. It's actually two items that I want to touch on. The first one was that you kind of led, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you led the charge to have the Oxnard Elementary School District be designated as a safe school. This was during the time of President Trump being harsh on illegal immigrants and deporting them. And you led the charge to designate the Oxnard School District, elementary school district, all 21 schools to be a safe place. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's actually been an ongoing thing. Even I'll actually cite Governor Pete Wilson, that during his time is when I came up. I was threatened to be sued by the state for speaking Spanish to my students. And I knew the law better than most of the people that made those threats. And I'm very proud to say that I was involved with another trustee at the time, Ana de Rio Barba, in a 7-day fast. Believe it or not, I went 7 days without eating. And we collected signatures at that time. This is about 12 years ago. And we took those signatures when we were done. We fasted at Plaza Park here in the center of Oxnard. We collected thousands of signatures to ask that the governor not cut funds for education. And we took them to Sacramento afterwards and delivered them to the governor's office. Really, the safe schools kind of came from that. But yes, our students need to know that we are not the police, that the right to an education goes to everybody. It's actually a human right. It's in the Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations, proposed by the United States. And a section is that a child has the right to a free education, free and equal education, no matter what their legal status, no matter what country they live in the world. And, rumors spread faster than truths. And, and quite often, I don't know how many times you heard about the, immigration being in Vallarta, but no, immigration does not go into the Isles of Vallarta. Though, I would get a phone call and you would get a phone call, I'm sure, saying that they were there. And we had to let parents and children know that they were safe in our schools. And there's always some blowhard somewhere that tells people not to go to school, for various reasons. And we needed to let our kids know that I would jump in front of a mob to protect my students. And I actually have several times. And I know teachers in general will teach. They don't care where, they came from. So, it's something that Oxnard needs to get a grip on still, because we're still fighting this.
Yeah. I also want to talk about a couple of years ago, under the former superintendent, Dr. Morales, budget cuts were proposed that was going to result, or actually not budget cuts, it was a change of law, a new law that came into place that was going to reclassify campus supervisors and other temporary employees. And now the districts had to make the choice, was to either roll them over or terminate them and then, hire them all based off of certain qualifications. You were one of 3 that voted in favor to just grandfather all these individuals in, but you were actually the voice that was very strong in saying that these people deserve to keep their jobs. The other trustees, they kind of took some convincing. How was that for you? You are technically, quote unquote, the minority on that board, the only Caucasian male, and you are standing up for the employees of this community, which has a very high population of minorities. How was that for you?
Yeah, this was actually surprising, and unfortunately, it brought out a lot. I would claim to a couple of my fellow trustees possibly ignorance, and I say that because this particular law had passed. The writer of the law, Tony Thurman, who now is actually the superintendent of public instruction in California, he wrote the assembly bill. And once he found out what was happening in Oxnard, he actually called up that morning of that board meeting to let the superintendent know and let the trustees know that that was not his intention. So when you have the author of the law saying, hey, you're laying these people off. Now, my problem was yard duty attendants, they live in our community. quite often they live down the street from the school. And quite often they're the grandma. It's not the 18-year-old kid who just got out of high school. Quite often it's the grandma that lives down the street, and she knows all the kids. And I've known a few of them. One in particular, I remember, she's passed since, God bless her soul. She not only was the yard duty attendant, but she was the instructor at catechism at the local church. By God, the kids listened to her when she told them to stop. She had God on her side. It's not certain of all of our supervisors of what their education was. And honestly, not even their status, their immigration status. An elderly woman who has worked for 30 years as a yard duty attendant is well qualified and should not have to reapply for a job. And didn't have to, even under this law. And a couple of my trustees didn't seem to ever hesitate on letting people go. One of the things, being a trustee, city council, you get the ego, and I've had an ego well before, but and I honestly look at them and say, are you voting to fire these people because you feel power? We didn't need to do it. And I'm very happy to say, going into that meeting, I think I was the only one. And I was happy to say, because I'm not going to get anything done unless I get 2 other people to follow with me. And we were able to get 3 votes. So that was a very good, a very warm, fuzzy moment.
I can honestly say, because I did attend that board meeting, and the amount of people, your guys' chambers was completely full, fully seated. They were standing along the wall. The lobby was fully seated, fully standing. And then you had people out in the parking lot that were very passionate and about, having people not lose their jobs weeks before Christmas.
Yeah.
That was one of those things that it was like absolutely insane that anybody would misinterpret something that would cause people so much grief. But I'm glad that you led the charge. Your words resonated with a lot of people, and thank God you were able to get those 2 other votes, and a total of it was a 3-2 vote in favor of just grandfathering everybody in.
And that's what you need.
And see, what kind of confuses me is the fact that for people to, and I'm not going to call out those individuals that voted against it, but I'm just saying that it is very interesting, to say the least, that individuals who believe, well, this is what the law says, even after getting a phone call and communication from the person that actually wrote the law, the bill, and still believe that, no, our superintendent is saying this, that's what I'm going to go with, as opposed to actually what the person that actually wrote it. So that always very confused me. But being an elected official, it's already a tough position. So we'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. So and votes are part of the record too, so people know. People can find out who voted for what on any given day.
Yeah, exactly. I want to talk about, because you've been a teacher, and you were a teacher up until recently. I want to talk about your experience. You have been in education for 30 years, and during this pandemic, I'm sure, like many of your colleagues, had to learn how to use technology that you normally wouldn't use for teaching. So tell me, how was that experience from you? Because that was from March to June of last school year.
Well, luckily I have 20-some-year-old sons in the house, so they gave me the tutorial on Zoom. But I've always been interested in the technology and I have to say that even back in Prop 187, we had this dial-up phone system called the the internet where we could email each other, and it made a world of difference. We couldn't, no cameras or anything, but so I've always been interested in how technology can support advocacy, and civil rights. So, yes, it was quite interesting. Luckily, we gave computers to our students. Well, the Oxnard School District was one of the first districts in the state of California to give each student a computer to take home. In fact, we beat LA Unified by about 1 month. And LA Unified screwed everything up, but that's par for the course. And one of the things that I argued, because the idea was we should put firewalls on everything, which they did in LA Unified. Well, truth be said, I said, no, I want this computer to go home so the child can study. And later with the pandemic, it became a necessity. But also so mom and dad can do their taxes, learn English, and find out what's happening in the world. Again, because a lot of people in our community, we need to support mom and dad, not just the child. And quite often, we have the child going home, and the child is the one that's translating for their parents. The child is the one that's educating their parents of what rights they have. Yeah. The kids are malleable. They bounce. The grown-ups, we have a little, we're a little more rickety, I think. Thank God we had that little first step that we had computers in the hands of the kids. I remember MyCop, the Mixteco Indigenous Community Organization Project. They had a radio station, but it wasn't over the airwaves. It was only on computers. And I remember going to the office and doing interviews on the radio, and I said, but if it's only on the computer, how is it that our adults can listen to your radio station? And the head of MyCop looked at me with a big grin on his face. He says, well, there's a school district that handed out computers to everybody. So, hey.
Let me ask about that, because I know you triggered a lot of people. I know you triggered me when you said the dial-up, because I remember hearing, I kind of got a little flashback of the dial-up sounds and the beeps. Being one of the first districts, and it's safe to say, and I believe you told me this before, that the Oxnard Elementary School District is the largest school district for elementary school district in the state. Am I right by that?
Yes.
Okay. The process to be able to get every student, and now this is 21 schools, how was that process to be able to get computers in front of all these kids for a school district so large?
Right. Well, luckily we put that in as part of the community accepted a bond issue that allowed us to have the money for this. We were not going to get finances from the outside, but from the outside and even internal within Oxnard, there were many people who thought that it was a waste, because why should we spend money on Latino students who are failing? And my answer is, well, that's exactly where you want to put the resources. And it's not because they're Latino, it's because they're failing. They're, unfortunately, they still are doing less than what we want them to do. And I would say the one word that has haunted me for all these years in our community struggle and in our education system is apathy. The apathy not to go to a board meeting, the apathy not to ask questions, the apathy not to, find out what rights and what possibilities there are for the child.
Yeah. I want to ask you now, being a trustee, in the Oxnard School District, being a teacher in the real school district, how was the balancing act between that? Did you have your superintendent afraid to say anything to you, your principal, and vice versa? You know, because
I had all kinds of targets on my head. Well, in El Rio, we had a superintendent at a time who was charged with shoplifting.
Mhm.
And before, after the incident and before it became public, because there was a few months in between, partly because I understand that people from the real district were threatening even the newspapers to report it.
Mm.
I found that out later as well. All of a sudden, I had heaven and earth fall on me. I could not do anything right. And I'm sitting around, saying, hey, on any given day, I'm not the best teacher in the world, but nothing that they were accusing me of was illegal or immoral. But, it's just like everything fell on me. What's happening? And then I turn on the TV one day and see that she had been charged with shoplifting shoes. Aha, you know, and hell, I was a teacher in the ranks of El Rio and a trustee in the largest school district in the county. Hey, the tallest nail gets hit the hardest.
Yeah.
And so I was the hey, look over there person, for a while. I had to be very careful. And I hope I'm very pro union and very pro teachers and teachers union. But in the politics of El Rio, I stayed away from that like it was the plague because I never wanted to be called a hypocrite if I could help it. And by the way, as an Oxnard School District trustee, I've given a lot more raises than I received as a teacher. So not too many people that can put that on a picket sign, and march around when they want to raise, huh? But it was a difficult balancing act, always.
Yeah, I would imagine. And yes, I remember back in 2016 when I first ran for office, that's when I actually met you. A couple of events, because of all the candidates, we always attend every single event possible. And I remember how proud you were to have the union bug on your signs, on everything, really. You were a huge supporter and still a huge supporter of unions and labor groups. So as a union member, I can say that I appreciate that support. And even you as yourself, as a former teacher, being part of a union, that's always nice to have that support from individuals when they support you. So Trustee O'Leary, you had an amazing 30-year education, 17 years as a board trustee in the largest elementary school district. What are the plans for the future?
I want to help the community where I think that I can be a positive influence in helping. In fact, I did run for a seat on the Harbor Commission, only to find out a lot of people thought that I might be able to fix the pothole in the front of their house because they lived at the beach. And that's not what the Harbor Commission is. Again, apathy is always an issue. And hey, I lost. Oh well. But I've not always won. And I want to try to be in a position where I can influence our community to do better. And everybody in the world believes me. Believe me, I've had people asking me and telling me that I'm going to run for the city council. I don't know. But one of the faults of Oxnard is we have the city council up here and everything below is below it. And, our community is only good as our education. I'm going to give a brief, even though I'm not a trustee anymore. We need to improve our schools to be able to improve our community. And I know that pothole might be, a terrible thing to have in front of your house, but you know what? The education of our kids is much more important. Oh, well. So, we'll see. Having said that, somebody will use that against me if I do run for city council someday. I'm writing books, you mentioned, and most of the books I'm writing are for students or for school. Some of the stories I wrote 20 some years ago. I got a bunch here. And the books, Esteban's Caravan, talking about a child trying to get to the United States for safety and being taken from his parents. It's a current event, and we do need to discuss this in schools and everywhere else. Remembering Cesar Chavez. This story actually started when I went to his funeral. And I was threatened as a teacher that I'd be fired if I took the day off to go to his funeral. I went anyway. And my fellow teachers asked me to write down what happened. And they actually read that story to their students. And then later, 20 some years later, it became a book. So, my name is America Paz. I am not illegal. The DACA students, and so we need to be truthful to the kids because the kids know what's going on. By the way, this is one of the last pictures in the book, and I do the art as well. This is from a photograph that I took. There was a young lady that had the butterfly wings. I thought, oh, that's perfect for the end of this book. Popol Vuh, stories for children. Not everybody, even Latinos, know what Popol Vuh is. It's a creation story from the Aztecs. Again, let's build some conscience, some pride. I'm standing in front of students whose parents work in the fields, who themselves on weekends and vacations work in the fields quite often themselves. I'm staring out the window of my classroom at a street that I know that Cesar Chavez lived down 2 blocks down the street and surely walked on that street himself. And yet my students, they all know who Martin Luther King is. They all know who Rosa Parks is because they studied about them since kindergarten, but they do not know who Dolores Huerta or Cesar Chavez are. That is an embarrassing shame. Part of the reason why I'm writing these stories. Another story I got the idea actually coming down in a van from Fresno with a van full of about 15 field workers from the United Farm Workers Convention in Fresno to Oxnard. And the question was, what item was the most dangerous thing that happened to field workers over the years? And their answer was the short-handled hoe. Because people had to work in the fields with a hoe that only had a 10-inch stick on it. So they had to bend down and weed for 10, 12 hours a day. That's why chiropractors are very, busy in Latino communities. That short-handled hoe. Grandpa had a bad back. So this is the story of Grandpa with a short-handled hoe. By the way, those are now illegal, but the handle on them has to be longer now so a person can stand. Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez had to fight for that law, and there was opposition for years to make that law. Little Cesar. This is a children's book for kindergarten, first grade about Cesar Chavez, and I've just finished and sent to the publisher the story of little Dolores. We need the kids to know about the history so we don't have to repeat the bad things. And the kids are the ones that go home and tell their mom and dad about that. So some of the books that I've written, but I plan on I still want to be busy. And even today I'm making phone calls. I'm looking into possibly trying to get into a doctoral program in Chicano studies, partly because my wife and my kids don't want me in the house all the time.
And it's also worth noting that many of your books are bilingual, so it's both
Yes.
English and in Spanish. So anybody can enjoy these books.
And can I point out that Popol Vuh is in English and Spanish and Mayan. And Mayan. I have another book that's it's only one page, The Pledge of Allegiance. It's in English and Spanish, and I have the Pledge of Allegiance as well in Mixteco. And it's a fallacy. People say Mixteco is an unwritten language. Wrong. It is a written language. Most people are not literate in it, but it is a written language.
Well, Trustee O'Leary, I've told you multiple times on how I've always appreciated your knowledge and your activism, and just hearing everything in this interview, it only makes me appreciate you even more, and makes me appreciate the fact that I can call you a friend of your knowledge that you have. So thank you for your years of activism, your advocacy for wanting to not educate, because when I say that, it kind of makes it seem like you're the white savior type, and that's not what you're trying to
Never, yeah.
what you're trying to do is just open people's eyes to their culture, to their history, and let them learn about it. Because that last book that you just showed, I have no idea what it's about. So I will be in touch with you to try to find out how to get my hands on these books. And actually, go ahead and tell how can people get these books.
All these books, all of these books are available on Amazon, but they're published through Floricanto Press. They have a website as well. And many of the books are actually available on Barnes and Noble on the internet as well. And many other, if you type in my name and the title or the subject or just my name in a book, in the word book, you'll probably get it on the internet.
Sounds good.
And it's all fun. Believe me, it's not a money endeavor, but I did not self-publish. I promised myself I would never self-publish. I did find the leading Latino publisher in the country decided to take on my subjects. I'm thrilled. And will I make money? Maybe a couple dollars over a long period of time, but we need to get these subjects out. And I promote anybody else's book on these subjects as well. We need to get books on culture and on our history, our community's history, into the hands of children.
I completely agree with you, Trustee. Again, thank you for joining me tonight in this conversation. I truly appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, former Trustee Denis O'Leary of the Oxnard Elementary School District. Please be sure to join us next week as we have former Oxnard Mayor Tim Flynn joining us. We'll be talking about his start in the public life and his experience leading the largest city in the county, as well as what his plans are for the future. That is right here on Oxnard Live at 4 p.m. next week, Thursday. Again, Trustee O'Leary, thank you again for joining me. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. This is Oxnard Live, all live and 100% real. Have a great night, everyone.